department since earlier this year. Prior to that, I was working with the arthritis program at Toronto Western, running their tissue biobank for just over 8 years. And so I've been where a lot of you are, in the thick of sort of research projects, working under multiple principal investigators, dealing with a variety of sample sets and data sets. So I hope that some of the examples I can provide you with sort of hit home and allow you to really relate to the content of this talk. So as Jennifer mentioned, the purpose of this talk really is to discuss some tools and some tips on how to help you best organize your study documents. And as mentioned, there's close to 100 folks on the line. Most of you, I believe, are from Toronto Rehab Institute, or Research Institute. Some others from the UHN community, and I believe there's a few external folks as well. And most people, it appeared, had on average about 5 years of research experience, which is great. And we've got some people who are working with Health Canada, a couple folks with the FDA as well. And as mentioned, I'm going to take a pause about halfway through to field some questions. But Jennifer, if you find that there's anything really urgent that you think should be addressed in the moment, please feel free to jump in. So just quickly, what I'll be going over today, we're going to talk about keeping a master study binder or file, however you like to call it, who's responsible for that, what are the essential documents that you really should be holding onto and keeping organized. I'm going to introduce you to a tool called the Master Study File Checklist. For those who do use them, I will touch briefly on lab notebooks. I'm going to introduce you to, if for those who haven't seen it yet, the Research Quality Integration Toolkit. We'll talk a bit about preparing for a research audit, and then I'll provide you with, and I'll show you how to access some of those internal resources as well. So when conducting research, we really want to consider the pillars of research. The first and most important in my eyes being participant safety. At the end of the day, we're all here to make our participants and our patients' lives better. The second pillar being data integrity. We want to ensure that the data we're collecting and analyzing for our studies is accurate, is compliant, which leads me to the third pillar, regulatory compliance. And this really has to start at the beginning of a study. When you're developing that research question, writing your protocol, if you have a well-researched and well-documented study, it will ensure that you're going to get those publishable results, that you have data integrity, and that you're complying with most regulations. And again, most importantly, that we're keeping those participants safe. So why should you keep a study binder? A master study file or binder, however you like to call it, can aid in reconstructing that story of your study and is really central to the scientific process. So imagine a perfect research situation where all the relevant documents you need are neatly stored in your master study binder, so that in the event of an investigation or an audit, all you have to do is pull out that binder and the entire story of your study is ready for review. In the case of preparing for an audit, someone other than you might need to read these study files. So it's important that they allow for interpretation and replication of your results. And it can also provide support to you in the case of an intellectual property dispute or a research misconduct or integrity case. Hopefully none of us encounter that, but you know, sometimes it happens. But in the case of an audit, an auditor should really be able to fully understand everything that took place in your study. You need to be able to provide clarification and explanations as to why things occurred in the study. And in the case of poor documentation, it can make it really impossible to reconstruct these events. So the Research Ethics Board or even journal editors might have questions regarding the conduct of your study. And having all of these sort of solid record-keeping practices in place throughout can save you a lot of work down the road. Another great example of thinking about how you want to organize your master study documents, and this one I stole from Jennifer. Imagine you're walking down the hall at Toronto Rehab, you've got your study binder in hand, and all of a sudden you slip. So embarrassing. Your files go everywhere, papers flying. How easy would it be for you to recreate the story of your study in proper chronological order with all the sections organized appropriately. Remember, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. A great way to think of things when you're documenting them is to consider that you might not always be involved in the study. You might change departments, you might change jobs, you might move to British Columbia. So at any time in the future, others need to be able to look back and clearly understand the work you did without question. So who is responsible? The principal investigator is responsible for the oversight and maintenance of all study documentation and data generated as part of their research studies at UHN. So the PI must ensure that any secondary uses of the data are consistent with any funding agreements or contractual obligations or any legal or regulatory requirements. Now, the maintenance of these study documents can be delegated. Typically, you'll often find it's a clinical research coordinator who might be organizing these, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the PI is still responsible in the event of an audit or any sort of regulatory infraction. So why is this important? In order to maintain those 3 pillars of research that I mentioned, it's really essential to keep all your study documents well organized and maintained. And this is the responsibility of all research staff. We must protect the data used for research and, of course, maintain its privacy. In the modern environment that we're all living in, we've got multiple methods of storing our data, transmitting our data. So the obligation to protect this data requires increased vigilance. So the Tri-Agency Framework for Responsible Conduct of Research, which is a lovely document, and I encourage you all to take some time when you're working from home to look it over. Section 4.5 states that the institution is responsible for promoting education on and awareness of the importance of responsible conduct of research. Another reason why we're all here today. And there are a few internal UHN policies that refer to responsible conduct. And there's also a policy on data ownership within UHN, and I can provide you with those links at the end of this talk. So we've discussed who's responsible and why it's important to keep your study documents organized. Let's discuss what type of documents should be in a master study binder and what should be kept separately. So first off, what should be included? Really any materials related to the overall conduct of your study. This would be de-identified study information only. So as you can probably guess, what should not be included in a study binder would be any identifiable study information, such as signed consent forms, completed case report forms. You really need to sort of look at your study team and consider where you have to store these documents. If you're a small group and only the research staff are handling these documents on a regular basis, it's okay to have them stored in the same location as long as it's secured. But if you're dealing with a really large group, you have students coming in every year, you have site monitors or sponsors visiting that need to view these de-identified documents, it's really important to store those things separately, and certainly at the very least in a separate binder. And just to clarify, all our documents should always be stored under double lock, double key. So in a locked filing cabinet inside of a locked research office, or on an encrypted research computer inside of a locked office. Those are some examples. So with regards to document retention, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors and UHN policy states that all documents need to be retained for at least 10 years after the research project has ended, or whichever regulatory body supporting the study, the longest time frame would apply. So for Health Canada, it's currently 25 years. Now, I believe there is a petition in place to change that to 15 years, and that's to sort of keep in line with other international regulatory bodies. But an important note would be other parts of your study documents might have different retention times. So an example of that would be if you're dealing with transportation of dangerous goods, those documents only need to be kept on hand for 2 years. So we want to ensure, if you look at that top image there, that your study binder, your study documents are all nicely organized and put together. In the event of an audit, we don't want to be in the situation in the bottom image where you've got piles of papers everywhere, not easy to find things, nothing's in order. So at our department, we've created a master study file checklist, which you can use to help organize your study binder and ensure that you're including all of those essential documents. This is a template and it can be modified as needed to reflect the needs of your research division or department. So I'm just going to go over sort of the key essential items that are in that document that you'll want to have on hand. So first being your key study info, your REB number, the title of your study, the PI and co-investigator names, the site where your study is taking place. Really any contact information related to the study you want to always have on hand. So contacts for your PI, your sponsor, if you're dealing with pharmacy or a laboratory, really any key people in that study team. If you're dealing with any sort of contracts or agreements, both internal or external, perhaps between the PI and the sponsor, any confidential disclosure agreements, grant agreements. If you're dealing with data or material transfer agreements, you want to keep all those compiled. Of course, you want to have a copy of your Research Ethics Board approved current protocol, as well as any amendments that you might make throughout the study. And it's a really great idea to track the version numbers and version dates of these documents. Again, if you're walking down the hall and that binder goes flying, you want to be able to put everything back in order. And that way you can always look back and see, okay, on this date, we added this task to the protocol to really ensure that you're not deviating. Speaking of which, you want to track those protocol deviations. There are templates available in our toolkit on how to track your deviations, and I can show you that a bit later on. So similar to the protocol, you want to always keep on hand a current copy of your approved consent form, as well as any older versions. Again, tracking those version numbers and version dates, so you can go back and say, you know, on April 1st, we started consenting the patients to take an extra vial of blood. So you want to ensure that patients that were consented prior to that date, you're not taking anything extra or asking anything extra of them that they didn't already consent for. Really any patient-facing documents you want to keep on hand. If you're doing any sort of advertisements for recruitment, patient questionnaires, anything that's been approved by the REB, you should have a blank copy of that on hand. Speaking of the REB, you want to keep on hand your application forms, your approval letters, any annual renewals, any important correspondence that you feel you've had with the REB that is affecting the conduct of your study. I would keep that all together as well. So for those of you who are working with Health Canada, the FDA, it's essential really to keep all of those documents compiled and together. So your qualified investigator undertaking form, your clinical trial site information, for those working with the FDA, your statement of investigator, your financial disclosure forms, really any communications, annual renewals, reports from regulatory bodies. Even if you're not working with Health Canada, let's say you're working with a granting agency, you might have certain regulations from these funding bodies that you need to be following. So any communication with them is important to keep on hand. Case report forms. So similar to your consent form and your protocol, you want to keep a blank copy of your case report form on hand, as well as any amended versions, anything that's been approved by the REB. And again, tracking those version dates and numbers. So this is not the space to keep your completed case report forms, as those might have personal health information on them. You want to keep on hand your study staff information. So study-specific training logs, proof that you've all taken good clinical practice training, any relevant licenses that your PIs might need to conduct the study. Basically anything you feel that would be relevant in the case of an audit to prove that your staff members have adequate training to complete those study tasks. Which leads me to my favorite document, the study task delegation log. So this is so important, and I'll show you what that looks like here. This document must be updated and reviewed by the PI with every staff onboarding and offboarding as part of your study. This document, think of it as your sort of map. It can allow you to trace back to who worked on the study at any given time. And when you're considering what tasks to put on your delegation log, it wouldn't be something like, oh, Joe is getting the coffee for the team meeting. Consider which tasks really contribute meaningfully to the data. Those are the type of things you want to put. And I'm just going to point out some relevant sections. So obviously you want your study information at the top, your protocol number that's been approved, the PI. Here's sort of a list of tasks. A lot of these are sort of generalized. And again, this is a template. You can modify it as needed. So you want to have your study members fill out their name, their title, sign an initial, and acknowledge that they do agree to complete the tasks that have been delegated to them and that they have been adequately trained. So you want to indicate the start date. But one column I want to draw your attention to, which is often overlooked, is the end date. Very often, we have projects that go on for years here at UHN. You have staff that might move to a different role or a different team. And very often people forget to indicate the date that they stopped working on a project. So I would highly encourage you to have your PI review this document, depending on the size of your study and how sort of active it is, on maybe a regular basis, whether it's monthly, quarterly, whatever you deem to be appropriate. So I can take a quick pause here if there are any questions.
Okay, so it looks like there's one question from Lisa. It says, should the PI be completing the delegation log, or should the study lead complete this? Or can the study lead complete this?
Yeah, so it can be filled out by your coordinator or your study lead, but it's really essential that the PI review this document, and there is a column on the end there for them to sign off. Because at the end of the day, they are responsible. They need to acknowledge that, yes, I've reviewed my study team, these people have been appropriately trained, and I approve for them to be delegated these tasks.
Okay, perfect. So we don't have any other questions at this time, but I'll just remind people that if you have a question at any point, even like before Amanda's presentation is over, feel free to put it in the chat box, and then as it occurs to you, and then we'll review them at the end. She will reserve time at the end. And also I know that a few people joined late, and there were some private queries to me about whether or not the resources like this master study file checklist will be made available afterwards. And the answer is yes. So all of the resources Amanda's talking about today, including a recording of this presentation and a copy of these slides, will be made available to all participants in the workshop.
Okay, great. So just continuing on, some other sections of that master study file checklist that you want to keep in mind when you're considering your documents that you're storing. SOPs. So it's a really good idea to keep a copy of your SOP master list here, referencing specifically which SOPs pertain to this study. So I know different departments like to arrange their SOPs in a different format. Sometimes you have sort of divisional or institution-wide SOPs that you need to follow. Some, specific research teams have their own set of SOPs. Really just kind of using your own common sense and logic of what you think should be stored on hand in your master study file. Personally, I like to store study-specific SOPs together with all my other documents. And then I'll keep like a master SOP file on hand as well in the event of an audit. That way it's easily accessible, and you can show that you do have SOPs in place, and that you can prove also that you've trained your staff on these SOPs. So with regards to study participants, it is okay to store your de-identified screening and enrollment logs here. Keeping in mind that this is something separate from a master participant identification list. This would be a type of list where you would keep, your participants' names, numbers, contact information, a lot of personal health information, perhaps. those need to be stored separately. But if you have enrollment logs that are just coded with numbers and dates, you can store those here, because very often a sponsor might need to review those on a site visit. If you're doing anything that involves randomization or blinding procedures, you want to keep those codes separately and secure, especially if part of your research team is blinded as part of the process. You really want to ensure that those folks have a restricted access to these codes. Safety reporting is another key thing that can often come up in an audit. You need to retain any records of reports about unanticipated problems or serious adverse events. Anything that is reported to the REB or your regulatory bodies, you want to keep those records on hand. And we do have an internal policy on when you need to report to the REB, and I can provide you with that link as part of that resource package. But just keep in mind, for a serious adverse event, if you are dealing with Health Canada, it needs to be reported immediately within 24 hours. And then you have a week to 2 weeks, depending on the type of event, to file that report with them. So investigational products. I saw that some of you are dealing with drug products, natural health products, and medical devices, I'm sure is quite popular at Toronto Rehab, especially. You want to keep any information related to those on hand. So your product brochure, your product monograph, the medical device manual, a sample of your product label. If you're dealing with anything that's being shipped to you, you want to keep those shipping records on hand. If there's anything that's temperature sensitive, usually there's a shipping temperature log. If you're dealing with anything that's batch sensitive, you want to keep those batch and lot numbers on hand as well. Little things like that that people often don't think about, but then later on when the data analysis occurs, if there's something funky going on, you can always go back, refer to those lot numbers and see, was there an issue with this batch? I don't know. So it's better to kind of store more information from the get-go and then save yourself some work down the line. So equipment maintenance. I'm sure this is something that everyone at Toronto Rehab is very familiar with your seal lab and all the amazing equipment that you folks are using. You want to keep on hand those validation records or calibration logs, equipment certification, anything to do with the quality and functioning of that equipment. Really just consider which pieces of equipment are measuring the most important data points that are contributing to your study. So, you know, just because there's a fridge in the room doesn't mean you have to keep the temperature log for that fridge. But if it is holding your study investigational drug product, let's say, then that's something you need to consider when you're looking at equipment. So for those in a laboratory environment, you want to keep your UHN biosafety certificate on hand, any lab certifications, calibrations, licenses, freezer temperature logs. As I mentioned, I used to work with the biobank, so we had a lot of freezers, a lot of tanks, and we actually ended up getting an electronic freezer monitoring system that would track all of our pieces of equipment that contained research samples. So in the event of, let's say, a freezer broke and the temperature started to rise, I would get a phone call very often at 2 or 3 in the morning, which was good because you could address the problem right away. Sometimes we did have freezers break or tanks break, and you need to think of the value of what's inside there and how it's going to affect your research. So there's lots of things to consider when you're working in a lab environment or with pieces of equipment. And I could go on and on about biobanks and freezers. If there's anyone that's specifically dealing with those issues, I'd be happy to chat with you offline about those topics. So any sort of site visit or monitoring reports that you might have, you want to keep on hand, especially any corrective actions that might have come out of your site visits, anything pertaining to your data safety monitoring board, really any sort of communication or supporting documentation, both internal and external, If you've had an agreement with LMP and they're going to be doing some sample analysis for you, you want to keep those agreements on hand. Even something simple like you've had a meeting with your study team to discuss the authorship of your project. Sometimes it's worth keeping those, meeting minutes or emails on hand, just so you can go back later and say, oh, we did decide on this, or oh, we need to modify this. And if you are archiving any records and sending them off-site, it's really important to take note of where those records are going, whether it's Iron Mountain or something similar, when they left the site, what documents were sent off-site, and of course the time frame that these documents need to be retained for. And it's always a good idea to sort of keep up to date with these external vendors, because the people who work there might change, their ownership might change. And if you're expected to retain certain documents for that 25-year timeline, that can add up. And that's a cost that you really should consider early on when you're determining the budget for your research project. So for the folks who do use lab notebooks, I just wanted to touch on it briefly. So the purpose of a lab notebook really is to record the procedures or actions that you take in the lab, including the reagents you use, the observations you make, really any relevant processes that would enable another scientist to reproduce your observations. Again, remember, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. It's important to note that your lab notebook does not actually belong to you. It is the property of the research institution, but it is your scientific legacy. So really consider what you're writing in there. It should be written from an objective standpoint, not, I thought this about the results, but really what the results were and the objective observations that you made. So there's a variety of different types of lab notebooks and pens that you can get. The preferred method would be a bound or stitched book, similar to what you see in the photo there. And you really want to be sure that you're using a permanent ink. Try and keep it consistent. There are some sites where you can go to where they've sort of reviewed different types of lab pens and have seen which ones are more prone to bleeding and stuff like that. So if you accidentally spill something in the lab, you're not losing that valuable data that you've collected. Of course, you never want to remove pages. That's why a bound book is preferred. It's a bit more obvious if someone has tampered with a bound book. It's a good idea to number your pages. And if you do make an error, you can neatly cross it out with one line. It should still be legible what's underneath, and you want to sign and date that error. Because let's face it, we all make mistakes. And of course, and this goes for anything in research, we never want to erase data or white out any data. Basically, your lab notebooks should be taken as seriously as Ryan Gosling takes his love for Rachel McAdams in the movie The Notebook. And that is the extent of my jokes for this presentation. So here's a quick glimpse of our RQI toolkit. It is available internally to everyone at UHN, and I can show you how to access that and what that sort of looks like at the end of our talk. So just keep in mind, it is currently under construction. There will be a new version of this toolkit available soon through Confluence. Again, that will be accessible to anyone within UHN. So as I mentioned, it's always a great idea to think of how you're documenting your work by considering what would be needed in the event of an audit and what records do I need to assure participant safety. And again, I want to reiterate, it is my colleagues at RQI that do perform some of the internal audits. And the intention is not to come in and sort of shake our fingers at you and say, this is all the things you're doing wrong. That's not our intention at all. We really want to be proactive in helping all of the researchers ensure that they're getting that high quality data, that we're keeping our participants safe, that we're following the rules. We're really here just to ensure and help you guys do the best possible research. So I want to provide you some tips on how to prepare for an audit. So first and foremost, really just utilize that master study file checklist and any other relevant documents or templates that you will have at your disposal now. So I had a chat with my colleagues who perform the audits here at UHN, and they provided me with some common sort of issues that they find during their audits. So the first being training after delegation. So you want to be sure before you add someone to that delegation log that they have received the proper training and they have dated proof of said training. Similarly, we often see delegation after work. So ensure that the staff that are completing a particular study task that is first noted on that delegation log. So an example would be, let's say you have a clinical research study assistant who's consenting patients starting April 1st, but it wasn't added to the delegation log that they would be consenting until May 1st. This is an issue that we'll often see in audits. In general, missing records. So you want to keep on hand every single consent form for every patient involved in the study, even if you later deem that patient to be ineligible. We never want to dispose of any sort of study records or destroy records. Just general sort of inconsistencies we might see, especially when you're dealing with both hard copy and electronic records being used. Things like ensuring you're using the current REB approved consent form. That's something that we might see. So really just pay attention to those version dates and version numbers. And just to give a brief side note on electronic data storage, you want to be sure that this is done on UHN encrypted computers, and it's wise to save any and all study data on a UHN drive to prevent data loss. If you've got all of your study information on one laptop, we all know how reliable electronics can be. Or let's say, again, you were walking down the hall and you dropped that laptop. That data is gone now. So really consider where you're storing the data and how you're storing the data. So as I mentioned earlier, safety reporting is another key finding during audits. So you want to ensure that any safety reports are filed within those acceptable timeframes. So really just take a look at the regulatory bodies that you might fall under. Sometimes granting agencies, and certainly the REB, they all have requirements of when you need to report safety events. So another great tool that can prepare you, this was provided to me by Jennifer actually. It's called the Self-Audit Tool for Responsible Research Conduct. So this is more of sort of a self-reflective tool that you can ask questions about how you personally are conducting your research. So just as an example, the first question, if I left suddenly, my project could be completed or replicated because a clear methodology has been established and presented in an approved protocol. So questions like that, really just asking yourself, am I documenting things properly? Am I storing them properly? If God forbid, something happened to me and somebody else had to pick up those study documents and carry on without me, would they be able to do that? So it's definitely an important thing to consider. And we have a new tool from our department, which is going to be coming soon, and it's a quality self-review. It's going to be available through REDCap. And this is something that either the PI or the study coordinator can go in and complete. So you'll log in through REDCap. You'll answer a number of questions. These questions will be more pertaining to the conduct of your study specifically and what events are taking place in your study. And at the end of that questionnaire, it can sort of identify some buckets or gaps that might need filling, and we're happy to assist you in filling those. And this is something that can be done at any time, or let's say you find out you do have an audit or a site visit coming up and you want to sort of prepare yourself, this would be a good tool to utilize in that situation. So as I mentioned, we've got a number of resources available, and sometimes it's just a matter of asking and looking and finding. So I'm taking the work out of it for you. We do have the clinical research toolkit available, and in that contains a number of templates that you might find useful in conducting your study and organizing those study documents. We are available through the research intranet page, and I can show you where to find us on there. And there is a helpful SOP template that we have called the Master Study File. And so this is essentially an SOP template that you can, again, customize to your needs. And so you can have some instructions written out for your team on exactly how you want your study documents organized and managed. As I mentioned, there are a number of UHN research policies that pertain to research, and I can show you where to find those on the corporate intranet. There are a ton of really great lab notebook resources if you're looking for more information on lab notebooks. And again, please feel free to reach out to me if there's something specific about lab notebooks or anything in this talk that you want to sort of delve deeper into. So you can contact us. We do have a departmental email, which is rqi@uhnresearch.ca, or you can reach out to me personally at any time at Weston@uhnresearch.ca. So our department is always available to do a quality consult. If you want to sort of have us come see, take a look at these your master study documents, make sure that there's nothing missing, or if you have specific questions, we're happy to address those at any time. And as Jennifer mentioned, we do have a program called the Quality Clinical Investigators Program, or QCIP, as we like to call it, which is run quarterly. And unfortunately, we had to cancel the April session for obvious reasons. So the focus of that program, currently it's geared towards PIs or fellows within UHN. It was a 3-day in-person course that heavily focused on sort of case examples and discussions. We always get a lot of really great group talk going on in these sessions. As a result of our changing world, we will be revamping the program to turn it into sort of a more virtual format. So stay tuned for updates on that. Now, I do just want to quickly show you where you can find some of those resources. So you should all be able to see the UHN Research Toolkit. Just, Jennifer, let me know if you can't see that. So you can log in. You need to be connected either remotely or be on site. You'd log in with your UHN Research account. And this is what it looks like. So not only are there templates and resources here, but there's a lot of information resources here available to you. But if you go to the bottom and you click on sample templates, you can see quite a large list of different templates that you might find useful, such as a delegation log, or a monitoring plan, or a freezer temperature log. And I apologize, the master study file checklist is not actually on here. As I mentioned, it is under construction, but I will certainly share that document specifically with you. So the other thing I wanted to show you was where to find us on the research intranet. So this is the home page. You just click on departments, and we're at the bottom here, research quality integration. And there's a number of different resources on here to assist you. We've got pre-inspection audits. There's a whole section on SOPs. If you're looking for information on how to write SOPs, different SOP templates. We've got a page on the QCIP program, as I mentioned, research integrity. And there is a section here, if you are doing any COVID research, there's some guidance for clinical researchers here related to that. And the one other thing I wanted to show you was on the corporate intranet, here is the site where you can find all of the research policies and procedure manuals that pertain to research here at UHN. Unfortunately, I apologize for those folks who are external to UHN. You won't be able to access anything that is linked to the intranet, but I'm happy to field any of your questions or concerns regarding organizing your study documents. And the last thing I wanted to show you was this master study file SOP template that I mentioned at the end. So again, this is a template. It can be modified based on the needs of your department. So you can essentially write out instructions on how you want that master study binder to be organized, who's responsible for monitoring or organizing those documents. And this is a document that I think the PI should be designing and heavily involved in as well. So I'm happy to field any more questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you so much. That was excellent, extremely informative. And if others are like me, then I was pleasantly surprised and excited by all the resources that are available that I didn't actually know about beforehand. So it's amazing what UHN research quality integration is doing. So we do have a couple questions. Take my glasses off. So I think you've answered a few of them, but I'll just review some common themes. So one question relates to digital, keeping files digitally. So a lot of reference was made to lab binders and lab notebooks and things like that. But how acceptable is it to have electronic record keeping?
It is absolutely acceptable, and I've thoroughly encourage people to get away from hard copy paper and sort of give the environment a bit of a break. But some things to keep in mind when you are storing electronic research data, again, really just ensure it's on an encrypted UHN device or an encrypted USB. Preferably store it on the UHN network. That way, even if you accidentally delete a file, UHN Digital can help you retrieve that. If you're only storing it on a specific device or USB key even, it's not as reliable. And we've all seen examples of that where people's laptops die, you get the blue screen of death, and that's the end of it. The other thing to consider when you're looking at electronic documents is using a system that has an audit trail function. So I know recently they opened REDCap to all researchers at UHN. You can go in there and design questionnaires for your patients to complete. Some people might be using Datos. And most of these programs, pretty much all these programs, if they're PIPA compliant, have an audit trail function so that you can go in later on and see, oh, Jennifer made the change to this data on this date at this time. And if there's ever a question, you can ask the person or confirm, oh, why was this data changed? Oh, it turns out I was verifying it for my colleague who entered it incorrectly. Here's the hard copy example. Okay, great. So there are a lot of things to consider when you're storing documents electronically. First and foremost, just have it in a place that's backed up on a UHN hard drive.
Okay, perfect. I'm just going to also mention quickly that Miriam put a link to a survey in the chat box, and I think she also emailed it to all registered participants. So if you don't mind filling out that survey, it's just a couple questions, I think 5. That would be amazing. One question asks if there's any more information or anything you want a deeper dive into that Amanda touched on today. So that would be really helpful to get your feedback on that as well. So I know some people are logging off, so before you do, if you could just click on that link, that would be great. Okay, so here's a question that says, does the master study file have to have sample copies of safety reporting and other forms or actual completed SAE reports?
So with regards to safety reporting, if there is situations where you have a safety event that needs to be reported, I would keep those actual reported files on hand. It is a good idea, however, and I should have mentioned in the talk, I apologize, to have an SOP, what to do in the event of a serious adverse event. How do you report it? When do you have to report it? Those are some things to consider when you're writing study-specific SOPs. But no, you don't need to keep, I mean, if you have a safety reporting template that you want your team to use, by all means, keep that on hand. But once you fill out a safety report or submit it to any of the regulatory bodies or the REP, definitely save those records.
Great. Okay, so there's one question about the frequency of updating study binders. So how often do you recommend updating them? Like every month? I know it's ideal to update study binders as soon as a document is updated or changed, but for the instances when when you don't get around to it immediately, with what kind of regular frequency would you suggest updating it or reviewing it?
That's a really great question. We've all been there. Research gets busy. Things like maintaining these binders often get overlooked. But I would really encourage you as a study team to sort of decide at the beginning of the process, how often should these binders and documents be reviewed? If you set a goal for yourself of, okay, we are going to review it on a monthly basis, or maybe if you're dealing with a bigger study team on a quarterly basis, you really need to decide what's best for your team. And in saying that, it's just to prepare you for the event of an audit, or let's say you do have an adverse event that happens. You want to be able to just go to those documents and have them ready. Go to those SOPs and have them ready. So really just keep in mind, what do you think is going to work best for you and your study team?
Okay, great. Okay, question about where is this self-audit tool for responsible research conduct located? Do we have access to use it? So Amanda mentioned that I brought that to her attention, but it was actually given to me by Angela Colantonio and her team several years ago, and I find it to be a very useful tool, and they helped develop it actually. So that will be part of the package that we'll share with you. As far as I know, I'm not sure that it lives anywhere right now, except that it will be sent to you as a part of these other materials. And just to answer another question that came up, and Amanda also touched on it, but there was a couple of people that commented on the fact that they're affiliate scientists, so they don't have access to the intranet. So again, all of these materials that were discussed today, apart from the extra ones that Amanda reviewed that are available on the intranet, but any of the ones that were discussed, we will make available to our affiliate scientists. And if you saw something that you would like to access but currently don't have access to it, please let us know and we will help make that available to you. Okay, now I think there's one more. So for SOPs, when you are using a standardized clinical test, for example, the Berg Balance Scale, where the testing procedures are published, what level of detail is required in the SOP?
That's a good question. So there's a lot of instances where this might happen, where there's already sort of an SOP or instruction manual available. You could simply refer to that in the sort of resource section of your SOP. You don't need to reiterate information that's already been documented somewhere else.
Okay, so unless I'm missing something, I think those were all of the posted questions. Thanks to people who are already sharing their positive feedback, but just a reminder again to fill out the survey if you have time now. If not, again, it's been sent to you separately. So, so please take time to fill it out afterwards. I'd very much like to thank Amanda again for such an excellent presentation and for bringing to light such incredible resources that have been provided by your group. And please follow up with us. So if you have any questions at all or anything that comes up that you think about as you're applying some of this new knowledge to your research activities, feel free to reach out and get additional input. Is there anything else you'd want to add, Amanda?
No, I don't think so. I hope that everyone was able to take at least one small thing from this talk. Again, I'm happy to provide information in more detail on any of the topics or sort of subject areas. You can reach out to me at any time, and just take care, be safe, and be well, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.